Podcasting, the latest frontier. These are the episodes of a Catch as Catch Can podcast. Its continuing mission: to explore strange, nerdy topics, to chat about sports, movies, sci-fi, and so much more. To boldly pod where this nerd has gone before.
Captain's Log, pod date 0917.19. On this episode of Too Boldly Pod, we're going to give you a little bit of a Star Trek discussion. Little something that I don't think a lot of people, novice Star Trek fans, knew, but I think it's very, very interesting about Star Trek The Next Generation and Phase 2. We're also going to have a quick little discussion about sporting referees with a poll that I took, which was a very surprising outcome. We also have this week's Too Boldly Pod question about if you were to move, what local object or product would you take with you? We're going to discuss a new podcast project that I've started up with my buddy Brian called Conspiracy Beerists. And we're going to take a look at what's in the news. So, Scotty, set phasers on stun. Engage. Now, this may come as a little bit of a surprise to some of you, but I'm kind of sort of a Trekkie, a fan of Star Trek. Shocking, I know. And I know on previous episodes of this podcast, you've heard me talk about individual episodes of the original series, and I even did a segment on the animated series. I'm not editing that because, yeah, it is what it is. But I thought today I'd come on here and talk about something that maybe the passing Star Trek fan may not be aware of. A couple things, actually, but, you know, the steadfast Trekkies will definitely know everything I'm about to say, but it's something that kind of gets forgotten in Star Trek lore. And what I'm talking about is last night I decided, you know what, I'm going to start rewatching Star Trek The Next Generation, which was, of course, the second series in the franchise, debuting in 1987. Now, I'm not necessarily going to talk about The Next Generation except for the pilot/debut episode encounter at Farpoint, and then I'm going to sort of correlate it with something that some of you out there may not be aware of. If you're just the passive Star Trek fan. Now, one thing I'll say about Encounter at Farpoint was it's one of the stronger episodes of the first season because most people know that Star Trek The Next Generation really didn't take off until the second, third season, and that's really where it gained its foothold on Trekdom, if you will. But that first episode was fantastic, and one tidbit that a lot of people may not know, again, Trekkies will know this, but the passive fan may not. Now, initially, when Gene Roddenberry wrote the story for the pilot episode, and it was green-lighted, the executives at Paramount really wanted it to be a 2-hour premiere episode. And even though it was going to be a syndicated show, they, again, really wanted a 2-hour premiere. And that was something that Roddenberry really tried to put his foot down about, and the executives at Paramount won that battle. So he had one part of the story written, and they needed quickly to incorporate a second half of the story or blend in a deeper story into that. And that's when DC Fontana, a longtime associate of Roddenberry in many Trek series before that and movies, stepped in with this idea to create a character that really became a focal point and a legend within the Next Generation. And it may not have happened had the executives not wanted to make it a 2-hour premiere. Now, what I'm talking about is, if you're familiar with the Encounter at Farpoint episode, it evolved or revolved around the Enterprise going to this planet that had this brand new space station, trying to get to join the Federation. And they were sent to solve the mystery of the Farpoint station. How could a quote unquote backwoods planet build this state-of-the-art space station in no time? And that was the part that Roddenberry wrote, and it ended up being they captured an alien being and forcing it to shapeshift itself into the space station. And again, that's where Roddenberry had written his plot. Enter DC Fontana, and her part to expand the story is when she incorporated the character Q. And even passive fans of Star Trek will know who the character of Q is and how important he has become, not only to the Next Generation, but the entire Star Trek universe from that point on. So hats off to DC Fontana for, I should say actually hats off to the Paramount executives for demanding that the Next Generation debut episode be 2 hours. And hats off, of course, to DC Fontana for the idea. But here's the thing a lot of people may not know, and I'm going to share this nerdy knowledge with you now. Star Trek The Next Generation was actually the second attempt to revive Star Trek in television form. Way back in 1977, this idea was pitched by Roddenberry to restart Star Trek on TV, and it was actually greenlighted, and they were going to do it. It went into pre-production. All of the original cast signed on to return, save for Leonard Nimoy, who refused to return to the character of Spock. But that's okay, because we're going to full circle all of this, and you might be a little surprised. So they got ready to start filming, or was getting ready to start filming, the new Star Trek series in 1977 called Star Trek Phase 2. And like I said, it had all the original cast minus Spock, and it had 2 new characters that they had incorporated into the plot, actually 3, that they had incorporated into the plot or storyline of Star Trek Phase 2. One was Commander Decker, who was going to be the first officer, and one was Lieutenant Ilea. Now, you may recognize those 2 names from Star Trek The Motion Picture. The third new character that was going to be part of Phase 2 was a Vulcan named Zahn. Now, we'll set him aside for now and try to work this thing from 77 to the debut of the Next Generation. Now, they decided at some point in pre-production or getting ready to start production on the series that what they were trying to do would be better suited on the big screen, so they scrapped the TV show and decided to focus on making Star Trek the motion picture. And as most of you know, they did end up getting Leonard Nimoy to sign on to play Spock, so the Zahn character was shelved. Now, in the writing of the script for the motion picture, Roddenberry brought Lieutenant Ilia and Commander Decker into Star Trek the motion picture. And that's sort of where Star Trek Phase 2 died at that point. And as you all know, Star Trek went on to have a very successful movie franchise in the 80s and 90s. Now bring us to 1987 with the debut of The Next Generation. Now, one interesting thing that Roddenberry did was he wanted that romantic past relationship drama that Commander Decker and Lieutenant Ilia was going to have in Phase 2 and did have in the motion picture. He wanted that also in The Next Generation, so he created the characters Commander Riker and Counselor Troy to serve as Decker and Ilia in much the same fashion for The Next Generation. And I'm not sure people ever really knew that fact about Star Trek or not. And the other final interesting thing is, I mentioned before, the Vulcan character Zahn that was supposed to be in Phase 2 and didn't make it into the motion picture because they ended up re-signing Leonard Nimoy to play Spock, is Roddenberry wanted to bring an emotionless character into The Next Generation. So instead of having Zahn on there, he created the android Data to fulfill the Zahn role for The Next Generation. So now that I've sat here and talked about sci-fi, Star Trek-y nerdy goodness for 10 minutes, I'm going to ask, did all of you out there know that? Do you have any thoughts about it? Let me know on Facebook or Twitter at Too Boldly Pod. Now, after the first few weeks of the football season, something is really, I won't say raised my ire, but just it made me take notice. And it's the thing of people complaining about refereeing. And that's an age-old thing in all of sports, but it just seems to be amplified now. Maybe it's because of social media, but I'm not really entirely sure. And within that, it goes all the way back to kind of like football and back to the NFC Championship game last winter with the Saints and the Rams. And it just really, and it seems like everybody doesn't want to admit or can't admit that their team lost because they weren't good enough. It was always some sort of conspiracy or cabal or a blunder or a blown call by the referees, when if you look at it rationally, with human error usually evens out in most games. Sometimes, teams seem to get screwed. Being a Lions fan, I can really attest to that. But you know what? I've made peace with it, and I know that when you have the human element within a game for the officiating, there's going to be mistakes made, and that's just something you have to kind of deal with. And yeah, being a fan means you're vested emotionally into your team, so your rooting interests lie on one side, and much the way it goes with many conspiracies, it's what you believe, and there's no way you're going to think otherwise. That being said, like I had mentioned, it just seems the first few weeks of this season there has been a lot of outcrying about officiating and whatnot, and it even stems into baseball. and basketball. And I don't hear too much about hockey, but it is a little bit. But basketball and baseball, and certainly football, there seems to be a lot of complaining about officiating. And ways to tweak officiating, you got replay in football. And after the New Orleans Rams game, they're testing out this challenging of pass interferences, which to me, I don't think that's going to really solve anything, because unless it's something extremely egregious, a replay is not going to overturn or call a pass interference play. But I could be totally wrong on that. And in baseball, there's, complaints about the size of the strike zone and whatnot, so much to the point that some independent minor leagues have tested with an electronic strike zone in certain games and whatnot, and trying to curb the rising flood of angst and anger from fans and players and coaches alike, to try to quell this growing tide of anger towards officials. And that just got me thinking. So I made up a poll on social media, and I simply asked people, with all the complaining about refs going on in all sports, would you rather have human refs with their human errors, or a computer or digital or camera refereeing in your sporting contests? And I was really shocked at all of the replies that I got. 100% stated they'd rather keep the human refs with human error within the games themselves. So that got me to thinking, is your complaining sort of part of the game? Is that something you need an emotional release to be part of your experience? Or is it that you've had a lifetime of human officiating and you've grown to sort of accept the human error element of it now? Because, nobody is perfect. Players make mistakes. Coaches make mistakes. It's apparent that officials are human, are going to make mistakes as well. It was just a little thought I had, and I've really been kind of stewing about it probably all the way back since the NFC Championship game last winter, when after that Rams and Saints game, you heard about all these lawsuits in New Orleans over the NFL and the officials and whatnot, and that's taken it a little too far, in my opinion. Yeah, we all get angry at blown or missed calls for our favorite sports teams, but you know what? In the end, it's just a game. It's just entertainment. So kudos to you for being so emotionally involved, but at some point, you got to come back to reality. And I think my poll with 100% proves that people understand that there's going to be a human element in each and every game. This week's Too Boldly Pod question comes from the archives, so to speak. And by archives, back in 2015-ish, I asked a different question every day for an entire year. Just, it's kind of a social experiment to get people to interact, to talk, to have some fun, as opposed to the negativity that always seems to be handed a boot in social media. Yes, I said a boot. But it's a fun little question, and it popped up in my memories. And I said, you know what, I'm going to ask that for a Too Boldly Pod Q and see how much fun we can have with it. So it's a simple question. If you had to move from your state or region, what one local product would you want to take with you? And I got quite a few interesting replies from some of you out there. Noted author, musician, radio host and podcaster himself, and a damn fine fellow, Paul Canellis, replied, Flint Coney sauce. No one else gets it right, dagnabbit. My friend Narek replied, can I just take all Chicago foods with me? Jody replied, Kogel Viennas and a Flint Coney. Shirley replied, Coke, not diet, the real Coke, pop. Fountain is the best. Okay. Jim replied, when we moved from Michigan, it would be Big John's Steak and Onion. Tim replied, Kogel's Pickled Bologna. Kelly replied, beef on weck, and then she shared a picture of it. Oh my God, did I drool. Kate replied, I can tell you that my husband has 3 things shipped in from Chicago. Matt's chocolate chip cookies, open pit barbecue sauce, and Lou Miletti's pizza. I'm probably getting that last name wrong, but Mark replied, Angelo's Coney sauce. Michael replied, Verner's. And Noreen replied, Kogel products. And I thought long and hard about this question myself, and there's a lot of Michigan-centric things that if I didn't live here anymore that I'd probably miss a lot, but I wouldn't necessarily want to take them with me or wish I had them with me. But one thing that has become abundantly obvious to me while doing this Spock Rock Radio thing, by talking to my friend Kelly, she moved from Buffalo to the West Coast, and every time we're sharing a drink doing timelines, and I mention I'm having a Labatt or a Molson, she's like, oh man, do I miss Labatt. So I think my choice would probably be my favorite Eastern Canadian beers, Molson's or Canadian, or Molson's and Labatt's. Maybe I should give myself the crickets. But thank you all for answering this week's To Boldly Pod question. It was a fun one, and I look forward to next week's. Just this past week, I have started a second podcast with my friend Brian, and on this podcast, we are going to have a little fun each and every episode. We're going to talk about conspiracy theories. And the easy way to put it is basically Brian is not necessarily a believer in all conspiracy theories, but he is a believer in a lot of them. And even though I'm not necessarily a believer in many conspiracy theories, I do find them very, very interesting. So each podcast, we're going to come on and talk about 1 or 2 different conspiracy theories. And it's sort of going to be played initially. We're going to try this out as he's going to be sort of the Mulder, the believe anything part of the podcast. And I'm going to be the nuts and bolts, prove it to me, Scully part of the podcast. And I think one of the coolest things that we're going to do with this is each time we meet up, we're going to meet at a local watering hole, a local bar, and set up the microphones and talk about this stuff in and around people. Now, it's not necessarily we're going to have people come and talk to us on the podcast. It's just, I think it'll give a good sort of atmosphere to the subject matter that we're going to discuss. Now, as I said, we're going to talk about conspiracy theories like, JFK and the moon landing and the flat earthers and Roswell and all kinds of stuff like that. And if you have a conspiracy theory that interests you, that maybe you think we should talk about on one of the podcasts, then by all means, let me know here on Facebook or Twitter, at Too Boldly Pod, and we'll definitely look into it. But one thing I did do preparing for that podcast and for this one, I asked people that listen to this podcast and people that follow me on social media, you don't necessarily have to believe in them, but what conspiracy theory do you find the most fascinating? And I got quite a bit of cool responses. Kirk replied the JFK conspiracy, which I'm sure at some point we'll definitely discuss. Kate said stuff involving Amelia Earhart's disappearance. Oh, and D.B. Cooper. Does he count as a conspiracy theory? I guess I like the aviation-related ones. And I'm pretty sure we're probably going to talk about D.B. Cooper at some point. And then she went on to say, and what's up with the Bermuda Triangle? When I was a kid, stuff like that, supposed stuff was disappearing left and right all the time, and now nothing. We might bring that up too, Kate. Rob replied, how about those Paulding lights? There's a tough nut to crack there. And if you remember a few weeks ago, Rob was on here with me because him and I went and investigated the Paulding lights. Andy replied, escape from Alcatraz. And Paul replied, I'm fascinated by the quick distribution of even the silliest conspiracy theories on social media. The FBI now considers them to be domestic terrorist threats. It's all gotten so bizarre. My granddaddy, in my opinion, is the Apollo moon landing man. I can't believe them moon conspiracies at all. But you know what? We're going to talk about the moon landing, I think, on our second or third podcast. So if you're interested in conspiracy theories or just want to check us out, where it is you download this podcast from, you can also download that podcast. And it's going to be called, since we're going to host each episode in a bar, we're calling it Conspiracy Beerists. Yes, you heard that correct. Conspiracy Beerists. B-E-E-R-S. I made myself laugh at least. I think it's a catchy name. It's going to be a fun little podcast. It's definitely going to be an explicit language podcast, but you know what? We're all grown and we can all handle it. So we've got a Facebook page set up if you'd like to follow us on there. It's Conspiracy Beerists on Facebook. And if you're so interested, check out the very first podcast that's downloaded now, the pilot episode, where we sort of overview the type of things we're going to talk about. We didn't get into too much detail. We were just chatting about what we wanted to talk about. So check it out. Let me know what you think either on the Conspiracy Beerist Facebook page or here on Facebook or Twitter at Too Boldly Pod. And in the news this week, and this comes from the UPI, and the headline is, Woman undergoes surgery after swallowing engagement ring in her sleep. A California woman who dreamed that she had to swallow her engagement ring to protect it from thieves woke up to find she really had ingested the piece of jewelry. Jenna Evans from San Diego said she had a dream Tuesday night that her fiancé told her to swallow her engagement ring to protect it from some bad guys on a high-speed train. When I woke up and it was not on my hand, I knew exactly where it was, she told KGTV. It was in my stomach. Evans went to urgent care the following day, where X-rays confirmed the ring was in her stomach and was unlikely to pass through her digestive system safely on its own. I was really happy because I don't know if I could look at it and appreciate it in the same way if I had to, search for it, Evans stated. Okay, first things first. I get people sleepwalk and do weird things in their sleep, but I don't think I've ever had a dream where I was dreaming I needed to eat a donut or something and woke up to find out that I had, donut crumbs all over my mouth. So what would make you... No. The hell is wrong with mankind? And that's going to wrap up this week's Too Boldly Pod. I hope you enjoyed the discussions we had. Join us coming up in future podcasts when we delve further into my surprising 2-0 start in fantasy football, waiting for the wheels to fall off that ship. We're going to sort of cross-pollinate a little bit with the podcast I discussed earlier that I started with my buddy Brian, talking about a couple of minor little conspiracies here on this podcast. And in less than a month, we have the first annual Too Boldly Pod Halloween special. As usual, I don't have a closer to this program, so I'll simply say this to kind of, since we're talking about conspiracies, back and to the left, back and to the left, back and to the left. Have a good day, everybody.
WLLP Spock Rock Radio.